He thought humiliating her would entertain the room, but he had no idea he was about to erase his own legacy in front of everyone who mattered. The grand recital hall of Westbridge Conservatory shimmered under golden chandeliers, every polished surface reflecting wealth, prestige, and the quiet arrogance of those who believed talent belonged only to a certain class. And at the far edge of that world stood Margaret Hale, her gray maintenance uniform simple, her presence nearly invisible as she wiped down the edge of a Steinway grand piano worth more than most people's homes, her movements calm, practiced, and unnoticed by the guests filing into their velvet seats, their tailored suits and evening gowns whispering status with every step across the marble floors. While at center stage, Dr. Victor Langston adjusted his cufflinks beneath the spotlight, a man whose reputation stretched across continents, a celebrated maestro, a gatekeeper of greatness, and a man who had built his career on deciding who was worthy and who was not, his sharp eyes scanning the room not with appreciation, but with quiet judgment, as if measuring each person against a scale only he could see. Margaret kept her gaze lowered, her posture steady, her world existing in the margins where no one asked questions and no one expected answers. And for years she had perfected that silence, blending into the background of institutions like this one, places where brilliance was praised loudly but humility was often mistaken for weakness. And tonight was no different, or at least it wasn't supposed to be, because as the final preparations unfolded and a ripple of tension passed through the backstage corridors, a sudden problem began to spread in hushed voices. The scheduled pianist, an award-winning prodigy flown in from New York, had fallen ill, leaving the evening's centerpiece performance hanging by a thread. And in the chaos that followed, Dr. Langston's irritation surfaced quickly, his voice cutting through assistants and faculty alike, sharp and impatient, until his gaze drifted, almost accidentally, toward the edge of the stage where Margaret stood, cloth in hand, her reflection faintly visible in the polished black of the piano lid. And in that moment something shifted behind his eyes, not curiosity, not respect, but something far more dangerous, a flicker of amusement. He took a slow step forward, the faint echo of his dress shoes tapping against the wooden stage as conversations dimmed, his presence alone enough to command attention, and with a half-smile that never reached his eyes, he gestured subtly in her direction. "You," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, and just loud enough to carry across the front rows. "You've been standing there long enough, haven't you?" A few heads turned, then a few more, until the room's attention began to pivot toward Margaret, who paused mid-motion, the cloth still in her hand, her fingers tightening ever so slightly as she realized she was no longer invisible. And though she said nothing, her stillness spoke volumes, the kind of stillness that comes not from fear, but from calculation, as if measuring the weight of what was about to unfold. Dr. Langston's smile widened just enough to reveal intention, and the audience, sensing something unusual, leaned forward in their seats, curiosity replacing casual conversation, because in rooms like this, unpredictability was rare and spectacle was always welcome, and he knew that. He thrived on that. "We seem to have an unexpected vacancy tonight," he continued, his tone light, almost playful, though the undercurrent carried something sharper. "And since you're already so comfortable around the instrument, perhaps you'd like to assist us." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, not cruel enough to be called outright mockery, but pointed enough to sting, and Margaret slowly set the cloth down on the edge of the piano, her eyes lifting for the first time, steady, unreadable, meeting the gaze of a man who believed he controlled every narrative in this room. And for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, something that no one else noticed, because they were too busy watching what they thought would be harmless entertainment unfold, unaware that the silence settling over the hall wasn't anticipation for a joke, but the quiet before something far more unforgettable. The laughter lingered just long enough to make its point, soft but deliberate, as Margaret Hale stood at the edge of the stage with every eye now fixed on her, no longer invisible, no longer part of the background, but a spectacle waiting to unfold. And Dr. Victor Langston, satisfied with the attention he had redirected, took a step back and gestured toward the grand piano, as if presenting a harmless opportunity rather than a calculated humiliation. his voice smooth and composed as he added, "Do not worry. We will keep it simple." A statement that drew another ripple of amusement from the audience because nothing about this evening had been simple. Not the venue, not the expectations, and certainly not the man orchestrating the moment. Margaret did not respond immediately, and that pause stretched just long enough to create tension, the kind that made people shift in their seats, whisper quietly, and raise their phones a little higher, capturing what they assumed would be an awkward attempt, something to laugh about later, something forgettable. But as she finally stepped forward, the soft sound of her shoes against the stage floor echoed more clearly than anyone expected. Each step measured, steady, unhurried, as though she was not walking into a trap, but into something familiar, something she had known long before this room ever existed. In the front row, Dean Robert Kingsley adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable but attentive, while a young student named Clara Simmons leaned toward her friend and whispered under her breath, "Is this actually happening?" Her voice barely containing a mix of disbelief and anticipation. And across the aisle, a pair of donors exchanged amused glances, already forming conclusions before a single note had been played. Dr. Langston moved to the side of the piano, his posture relaxed, his confidence unshaken, because in his mind the outcome was already decided, the narrative already written, and Margaret was simply following the role he had assigned her, a minor character in a moment designed to reinforce his authority. But what he failed to notice was the subtle change in the room, the way the air seemed to tighten, the way conversations faded not into laughter but into something quieter, something more uncertain. As Margaret reached the bench and paused, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood, her reflection faintly visible beneath the stage lights. And for a brief second her eyes lowered, not in submission, but in recollection, as if something distant had resurfaced, something older than the expectations pressing down on her now. She took a slow breath, the kind that steadied not just the body but the mind, and as she sat down, adjusting her position with quiet precision, the casual assumption that had filled the room began to shift, almost imperceptibly, because there was no hesitation in her movement. No fumbling uncertainty, only a calm that did not belong to someone out of their depth. Dr. Langston noticed it too, though only for a moment. A flicker of something he could not quite place passing through his expression before he dismissed it, straightening his jacket as he addressed the audience once more. "Let us consider this an unexpected interlude," he said, his tone carefully balanced between humor and authority, but the words did not land the way he intended, not anymore. Because the room was no longer responding on his cue, and as Margaret lifted her hands, hovering just above the keys without touching them, a silence fell that was different from before, heavier, more deliberate, the kind of silence that demanded attention rather than offering it freely. And in that stillness, the faintest detail became noticeable, the way her fingers curved naturally, the way her posture aligned perfectly with the instrument, not as a stranger approaching it, but as someone returning to it. And Clara, watching from the front row, felt a strange unease replace her earlier curiosity, leaning back slightly as she whispered again, this time softer, "Something is not right." And for the first time since the moment began, Dr. Langston's confidence met resistance. Subtle but undeniable, as if the story he had constructed was beginning to shift beyond his control, though he had not yet realized just how far it would go. And as Margaret finally lowered her hands toward the keys, the room held its breath, not for a joke, but for something no one could yet name. Her fingers touched the keys, and in that exact moment, the illusion shattered. The first note did not stumble, it did not hesitate, it landed with precision, clean and deliberate, echoing through the hall with a clarity that cut through every expectation in the room. And before anyone could process what they had just heard, the second note followed. Then the third, each one weaving into the next with a control that was not learned overnight, not practiced casually, but mastered over years that no one in that audience had ever witnessed. And the shift was immediate, almost physical, like a current passing through the air, as the quiet amusement that had filled the space dissolved into something far heavier, something closer to disbelief. Clara Simmons leaned forward in her seat, her earlier skepticism replaced by a tightening focus. her eyes fixed on Margaret's hands as they moved with effortless confidence across the keyboard, not searching for notes, not testing the instrument, but commanding it, shaping the sound with a level of control that even advanced students spent decades trying to achieve. And beside her, the donors who had exchanged amused glances just moments ago now sat motionless, their expressions frozen mid-reaction, as if unsure how to adjust to what was unfolding before them. Dr. Victor Langston remained standing near the edge of the piano, his posture still composed, but his expression no longer aligned with the confidence he had displayed moments earlier. Because this was not part of the performance he had orchestrated. This was not hesitation, not failure, not embarrassment. This was something entirely different, something that did not fit within the boundaries of his expectation. And as Margaret's playing continued, the complexity of the piece revealed itself, not simplified, not reduced, but executed in its full demanding form. Every passage delivered with precision, every transition seamless, her dynamics controlled with an emotional depth that transformed the room from a place of judgment into something closer to reverence. The sound expanded, filling every corner of the hall, reflecting off marble floors and high ceilings, drawing every listener deeper into a performance they had not come prepared to witness. And in that growing silence, the only movement that remained was Margaret herself, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, her focus absolute, as if the hundreds of eyes watching her no longer existed, as if the years between her past and this moment had collapsed into a single point in time. Dean Robert Kingsley slowly rose from his seat without realizing he had done so, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition began to form, not fully realized yet, but undeniable in its presence, while Clara felt a chill run through her, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that they had all misjudged something far greater than a simple mistake. Dr. Langston took a small step closer, his attention locked on the movement of her hands, searching, analyzing, trying to find an explanation that would restore his control over the situation. But with every passing second, that control slipped further away, replaced by a realization he could not yet admit, because the technique on display was not just skilled, it was elite. The kind of mastery reserved for those who had stood on the world's most prestigious stages, those whose names carried weight far beyond a single institution. And yet here she was, dressed in a uniform that suggested anonymity, performing as if the instrument itself belonged to her. The room remained completely silent now, not out of politeness, but because no one dared interrupt what they were witnessing. And as the piece built toward a more demanding passage, Margaret did not slow, did not falter, her fingers accelerating with controlled intensity, every note placed exactly where it needed to be, creating a tension that held the audience suspended. And Clara, barely breathing, whispered under her breath, "This is not possible," though no one responded, because they were all thinking the same thing. And for the first time since the evening began, Dr. Victor Langston said nothing at all, because there were no words left that could contain what was happening in front of him. The music surged forward with a confidence that no longer asked for permission, each phrase unfolding with deliberate control as Margaret Hale moved through the most demanding passages without hesitation, her fingers gliding across the keys with a fluency that erased every assumption that had been made about her only minutes before. And the room, once filled with quiet judgment, now sat suspended in a silence so complete it felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that forms only when something extraordinary replaces expectation. Clara Simmons could feel her heartbeat in her chest, her earlier curiosity now transformed into something deeper, something closer to awe, as she watched Margaret's hands move with a precision that no beginner could imitate, no amateur could fake. And she realized, with a growing sense of disbelief, that this was not simply skill, this was mastery shaped over years of discipline. Hidden beneath a life no one had bothered to question, Dr. Victor Langston stood, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the performance, searching desperately for a flaw, a misstep, anything that would restore the narrative he had created. But there was none, only a flawless execution that continued to build in complexity and emotional depth, the dynamics shifting seamlessly from quiet restraint to powerful resonance, filling the hall with a sound that demanded respect rather than invited critique. And with every passing measure, the distance between who Margaret appeared to be and Who she truly was widened beyond anything he could reconcile. Dean Robert Kingsley stepped further into the aisle, his posture tense now, his attention locked on the stage as recognition began to sharpen into certainty, his mind reaching back through years of performances, headlines, and whispered conversations about a pianist who had once redefined expectations and then disappeared without explanation. And as Margaret transitioned into a passage known only to those deeply familiar with the piece, adding a subtle interpretation that was not written but remembered, his breath caught, the realization forming with undeniable clarity. The final movement approached, and Margaret did not slow, did not falter. Her control absolute as she guided the music toward its conclusion with a confidence that left no room for doubt. And then, with a final sequence delivered with precision and restraint, she lifted her hands from the keys, allowing the last note to resonate through the hall, its echo lingering just long enough to remind everyone present that what they had witnessed could not be undone. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, the silence stretching longer than any applause ever could, because the weight of realization had settled over the room, pressing down on every person who had laughed, who had assumed, who had believed they understood what they were seeing. Clara's eyes remained fixed on Margaret, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Who is she?" Though the answer was already forming around her, in the shifting expressions, in the stunned stillness, in the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Victor Langston's composure finally cracked, not outwardly, not in any dramatic gesture, but in the subtle tightening of his jaw, the slight shift in his stance, the quiet realization that the control he had once held over this room had slipped away entirely, replaced by something he could neither command nor dismiss. And as Dean Kingsley stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence with a clarity that carried to every corner of the hall, the truth that had been hidden in plain sight prepared to surface, leaving no space for denial, no refuge for arrogance, only the undeniable weight of recognition that would change everything in a single moment. Dean Robert Kingsley's voice did not rise, yet it carried through the hall with a weight that silenced even the faintest breath of movement. That interpretation, that phrasing, there is only one person I have ever heard play it that way. And as he took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Margaret Hale, the final pieces of recognition settled into place, not as speculation, but as certainty. "Margaret Hale," he said, the name landing with a quiet force that rippled through the audience, unfamiliar to some, but to others, unmistakable, like a memory suddenly brought back into focus after years of absence. A murmur spread, hesitant at first, then growing, as fragments of understanding began to connect, whispered conversations overlapping in disbelief. "That cannot be. She disappeared. I remember. Years ago." And Clara Simmons felt the words before she fully understood them, her gaze shifting from Margaret to Dean Kingsley and back again, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of her with the legend now forming in the room. Dr. Victor Langston remained still, his expression carefully controlled, but the certainty that had once defined his presence had vanished, replaced by a tension he could not disguise, because he understood exactly what that name meant. He understood the implications of what had just been revealed, and more importantly, he understood what it meant for him. Margaret, however, did not respond to the recognition, did not turn, did not acknowledge the growing wave of realization behind her. She simply rose from the bench with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as though the performance had changed nothing for her at all. And in that calm, there was something far more powerful than any declaration, because it made clear that she had never needed their approval to begin with. Dean Kingsley continued, his voice steady. "You were at Carnegie Hall 10 years ago. You redefined that entire program." And the room reacted more visibly now, the murmurs sharpening into audible disbelief, heads turning, eyes widening, the collective understanding deepening with every word, because this was no longer speculation. This was confirmation, and the narrative that had been built only moments earlier collapsed completely under the weight of truth. Clara felt her face flush, not from embarrassment alone, but from the realization of how quickly she had judged, how easily she had accepted the assumptions presented to her, and around her, Others experienced the same quiet reckoning, their earlier amusement now replaced by something heavier, something far less comfortable. Dr. Victor Langston finally moved, stepping forward as if to reclaim the space, to reassert the authority that had defined him for so long. But when he opened his mouth, no words came, because there was nothing left to say that would not expose the miscalculation he had made, the arrogance he had displayed, and in that silence, his reputation, so carefully constructed over years, stood exposed in a way he could not control. Margaret turned slightly then, not fully facing the audience, but just enough to acknowledge the presence behind her, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and for a brief moment, they met Dr. Langston's, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a quiet clarity that said more than any words could. And in that single glance, the imbalance of power that had defined the evening reversed completely. She stepped away from the piano without waiting for applause, without seeking recognition, moving toward the edge of the stage with the same measured pace she had walked in with, leaving behind a room that no longer knew how to respond, because applause felt insufficient and silence felt too heavy. And as she reached the edge, the weight of what had happened settled fully into place, not as a spectacle, but as a lesson that could not be ignored. And in that moment, the room understood something it had failed to see before, that dignity does not announce itself. It reveals itself only when it is tested, and that night, no one would forget what they had witnessed, not because of the music alone, but because of what it had exposed in all of them. The silence did not break when Margaret Hale stepped off the stage. It deepened, stretching across the hall like a weight no one was prepared to carry. And for the first time that evening, the power in the room no longer belonged to titles, positions, or reputations. It belonged to truth, quietly revealed and impossible to ignore. Clara Simmons remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched Margaret move toward the side exit, her mind racing to reconcile the image she had formed earlier with the reality she had just witnessed. And she realized with a growing sense of clarity that the discomfort she felt was not about Margaret at all. It was about herself, about how easily she had accepted the role assigned to someone without questioning it, how quickly she had joined the silent agreement that appearance defined worth. Around her, the audience shifted uneasily, whispers returning but no longer filled with amusement, now carrying a tone of reflection, of quiet regret, as people avoided each other's eyes, each one aware, in their own way, of the part they had played in a moment that had turned against them. Dean Robert Kingsley remained standing in the aisle, his gaze following Margaret as she disappeared beyond the edge of the stage, his expression thoughtful, almost solemn, because he understood what the others were only beginning to grasp, that talent of that level does not vanish without reason, that brilliance does not hide without cause. And whatever had brought Margaret Hale to a place where she chose invisibility over recognition was a story far deeper than anything that had unfolded tonight. Dr. Victor Langston stood alone near the piano, the instrument now silent beneath the stage lights, its polished surface reflecting a man who no longer appeared as composed as he had only minutes before. And though no one confronted him directly, the shift in perception was unmistakable. It lingered in the way people glanced at him and quickly looked away, in the absence of the admiration that had once surrounded him, replaced now by something far less comfortable, something closer to doubt. He adjusted his jacket, a small, controlled movement, as if attempting to restore order within himself. But the room no longer responded to him, no longer waited for his cues, and in that quiet isolation, the realization settled in that authority built on assumption can dissolve in a single moment of truth. Near the front, Clara slowly rose to her feet, her hesitation visible as she took a step forward, then another, her eyes fixed on the exit where Margaret had disappeared. And though she did not follow, she understood something important in that moment, something she would carry long after the night ended. That respect is not given to those who demand it, but to those who never ask for it at all. The hall began to stir again, but the energy had changed completely. Conversations no longer centered on the performance alone, but on the realization it had forced upon them, each person processing it in their own way, some quietly, some with unease, but none untouched by what they had witnessed. And as the lights remained steady and the piano stood untouched at center stage, The absence of Margaret Hale became its own presence, a reminder that what had happened was not just a performance. It was a moment that exposed the difference between perception and reality, between judgment and understanding. And in that space left behind, one truth remained clear, that dignity does not need recognition to exist, but once revealed, it changes the way the world sees everything that comes after. The doors at the side of the hall closed softly behind Margaret Hale, but the echo of what she had done did not leave with her. It remained, settling into the walls, into the polished floors, into the quiet thoughts of every person still standing in that room. And for a long moment, no one moved with purpose, as if stepping forward too quickly might erase the fragile clarity that had just taken hold. Clara Simmons lingered near the front row, her eyes still fixed on the place where Margaret had disappeared, her thoughts turning over again and again, not on the performance itself, but on the moment before it, the laughter, the assumptions, the way she had leaned into the comfort of the crowd instead of questioning it. And now that comfort felt distant, replaced by a quiet determination she did not fully understand yet. Dean Robert Kingsley finally lowered his gaze from the exit and turned back toward the stage, his expression thoughtful, his mind already moving beyond the immediate shock into something more reflective, because he knew that moments like this did not happen by accident. They revealed something deeper about the systems that allowed them to occur, the hierarchies that decided who was seen and who was overlooked. And as he glanced briefly at Dr. Victor Langston, there was no accusation in his eyes, only a recognition that what had happened could not be undone, only understood. Dr. Langston, however, felt the shift more sharply than anyone else, though no one spoke directly to him. The distance around him was unmistakable. Conversations that might have once included him now formed just outside his reach. Glances that once carried admiration now passed over him with something quieter, something more measured, and for the first time in years, he found himself without the certainty that had always guided him, standing beside the same piano that had moments ago been the center of his authority, now a silent reminder of how quickly that authority could dissolve. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance, but the gesture felt empty, as though it belonged to a version of himself that no longer quite fit the moment. And in that quiet realization, the weight of what he had set in motion settled more fully, not as a public confrontation, but as a private reckoning that no applause could erase. Across the hall, a few guests began to move toward the exit, their steps unhurried, their conversations low and reflective, while others remained seated, unwilling to leave just yet, as if hoping to hold on to the clarity a little longer before returning to the familiar patterns that had been disrupted. Clara took another step forward, then stopped, her eyes lowering briefly as she considered following Margaret. But something held her back, not hesitation, but understanding that this was not a moment that required interruption. It was one that required reflection, and instead, she turned her attention back to the stage, to the piano, to the space where everything had shifted. And in doing so, she recognized that the lesson she had witnessed was not about music alone. It was about perception, about the quiet ways people decide who belongs and who does not. Dean Kingsley moved toward the center aisle, his voice low as he spoke to a colleague beside him, not with urgency, but with intention, already considering what this meant for the institution, for the culture they upheld. And though his words were not loud enough to carry, the direction of his thoughts was clear. Change does not begin with comfort. It begins with moments that challenge it. And as the hall slowly emptied, the stage remained as it was, untouched. The piano still beneath the lights, but no longer just an instrument, now a symbol of something revealed, something that could not be unseen. And in that lingering stillness, one truth settled quietly over the room, that the way people are judged often says more about those who judge than those being judged. And that realization, once felt, does not fade easily. Outside the grand hall, the night air felt different, cooler, quieter. As Margaret Hale stepped into the dimly lit corridor that led away from the stage, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, steady and unhurried, as though she had not just shifted the weight of an entire room with a single performance. And yet there was a subtle change in her posture, not in confidence, but in release, as if something long carried had finally been set down, even if only for a moment. Behind her, Distant murmur of the audience lingered, faint but present, a reminder of the world she had briefly stepped back into, a world that once knew her name, once celebrated her, once placed her under lights far brighter than those she had just left behind. And for a brief second, she paused near the exit, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe, her reflection barely visible in the glass. And in that reflection, there was no trace of the person they had assumed her to be, only the quiet strength of someone who had chosen her own path, regardless of how invisible it made her. Inside the hall, Clara Simmons finally gathered the courage to move, her steps quick but uncertain as she made her way toward the side corridor, her thoughts no longer tangled in confusion, but driven by a need to understand, not out of curiosity alone, but out of something deeper, a recognition that what she had witnessed was not just talent, but a choice, and she needed to know why someone like Margaret would walk away from a life most would never leave. As Clara reached the corridor, she slowed, her breath catching slightly as she spotted Margaret near the far end, standing beneath a soft overhead light, her presence calm, grounded, as if she had always belonged there more than on the stage itself. And for a moment, Clara hesitated, unsure if she had the right to interrupt. But the weight of the evening pushed her forward, one step at a time, until she finally spoke, her voice quieter than she expected. "Miss Hale." The name feeling unfamiliar, yet significant as it left her lips. Margaret turned slowly, her expression composed, her eyes steady as they met Clara's, and there was no surprise in them, no irritation, only a quiet awareness, as if she had expected someone to follow, though not necessarily who it would be. Clara swallowed, searching for the right words, but finding none that felt sufficient. I needed to say, "I am sorry," she managed, her voice honest, unpolished, carrying none of the formality that filled the hall behind them. And for a moment, the silence between them returned, not heavy, but reflective. Margaret regarded her for a second longer, then gave the smallest nod, not as acceptance of an apology, but as acknowledgement of understanding. "You saw what everyone else saw," she said gently, her voice calm, measured, carrying a quiet strength that did not demand attention. "And you believed it." There was no accusation in her tone, only truth, and Clara felt it settle, not as a reprimand, but as a lesson she had already begun to learn. "Why did you leave?" Clara asked before she could stop herself, the question slipping out with more urgency than she intended, and Margaret's gaze shifted slightly, not avoiding the question, but considering it, as if deciding how much of the answer belonged in this moment. "Because not everything worth having needs to be seen," she replied after a pause, her words simple, yet layered with meaning that extended far beyond the surface. And Clara felt the weight of them, the realization that success, recognition, and visibility were not always the same as fulfillment. Back inside, Dr. Victor Langston remained near the stage, the hall nearly empty now, his reflection staring back at him from the piano's polished surface. And for the first time in years, he did not look away, because there was nothing left to distract him from what he had seen, from what he had misjudged. And though no one confronted him, the absence of admiration spoke louder than any criticism ever could, leaving him alone with a truth he could not reshape. And in that quiet separation, between the stage and the corridor, between recognition and anonymity, the lines that had once defined status blurred completely, leaving only the undeniable clarity that dignity, once revealed, does not need to prove itself again. It simply exists, unchanged by the opinions that once tried to define it. Margaret Hale stepped out into the quiet street beyond the conservatory, the city lights stretching across the night in soft reflections against the pavement. And for the first time that evening, there were no eyes on her, no expectations pressing against her presence, only the steady rhythm of her own footsteps carrying her forward. And yet the weight of what had happened did not follow her as a burden, it lingered behind, where it belonged, among those who needed to understand it. Inside the corridor, Clara Simmons remained standing where Margaret had left her, the words she had just heard echoing in her mind with a clarity that felt both unsettling and grounding, because for the first time, she was beginning to see beyond the narrow frame she had always accepted, realizing that the world she had admired was built not only on talent, but on perception, and that perception could be wrong, deeply and quietly wrong. in ways that only moments like this could reveal. She turned slowly. Her steps measured as she made her way back toward the hall, but nothing felt the same. The familiar structure of the space now carrying a different meaning, as if the walls themselves held a memory that could not be ignored. Dr. Victor Langston remained alone near the stage, the final echoes of conversation fading as the last guests filtered out, leaving behind an emptiness that felt more significant than the crowd that had filled it. And he stood there longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the piano that had once symbolized his control, now reflecting something far less certain. Something that forced him to confront not just what had happened, but why it had happened, because the truth was no longer hidden behind performance or reputation. It stood plainly before him, unaltered by explanation. He took a slow breath, his posture shifting slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that does not announce itself but settles quietly, reshaping what comes next. And though no apology had been spoken, no confrontation made, the absence of both carried its own message, one that did not require words to be understood. Clara re-entered the hall just as the final lights began to dim, her eyes scanning the stage one last time. The empty bench, the untouched keys, the space where everything had changed. And she understood then that what she had witnessed was not just a moment of brilliance. It was a moment of truth, one that would follow her long after the night ended, shaping the way she saw others, the way she saw herself, and the way she chose to respond when faced with the easy comfort of assumption. Outside, Margaret continued walking, her pace steady, her path leading away from recognition and towards something quieter, something more personal. And though the world she left behind might speak of her again, might rediscover her name, it did not matter in the way it once might have, because she had already defined her own place within it, not through applause, not through status, but through a clarity that required no audience. And back within the silent hall, where the last light finally dimmed and the echoes faded completely, one truth remained, settled into the space like a quiet reminder that could not be erased, that respect is not granted by titles or appearances. It is revealed through character, and once seen, it leaves a mark that changes everything that follows.